contributions. Is that right? Okay, in that case, we move to the SNP spokesman, Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr McCabe. It's a pleasure to serve on your chairmanship. And obviously, I'd like to commend the Honourable Member for Glasgow Central for bringing forward this debate. But more importantly, Mr McCabe, I want to thank the Honourable Member for Glasgow Central for her tireless campaigning that she's done in this two-child policy, which frankly victimises and stigmatises families and children. It's worth putting on the record that my honourable friend was the first member to identify the pernicious rape clause in Budget Day in July 2015. And I think her speech shows just how much she's immersed herself, highlighting the unfairness of this policy and the ludicrous exemptions that go with it, and the fact, as she said, it's a poverty trap. The absurd situation that children born beyond the midnight deadline, she says, are not deemed worthy of support. The fact that they now have two-tier families that are the same size, but again, by virtue of when one child was born, one family gets more support than the other. It's absurd. And I'd like to also pay tribute to all the other honourable members who have contributed or made interventions. Honourable Member for Cunning Valley, who, as she said, it's about supporting all children, basic fairness, and why does this UK Tory government find it all too easy to breach human rights. The Honourable Member for Arfon made a powerful speech talking about his own circumstances, how things and political attitudes have changed. I think that example he gave about the moral condemnation of the past, of the people stuck in mental institutions, and how we're returning to moral judgments on people having children, that should make the minister sit up, because it certainly made me sit up. And then, of course, we had a fantastic contribution from the Honourable Member for Strangford. He did start with his Better Together comparison, but apart from that, I agreed with every word he said. And I think the Minister, when the Honourable Member for Strangford uses such strong language and condemns a policy so much, and I do think genuinely that's the best speech I've heard from the Honourable Member for Strangford, which says a lot, but it was a really powerful speech. If the Minister doesn't listen to that and take note, there's something far wrong. I mean, the example I gave of the Chinese limit and the attitude of what that would mean or how that would impact families and people here had such a policy been implemented. But I think also the fact that he said about the dark perspective of this policy, and it's morally wrong, and not just that, it's actually been an abject failure in its aims, really summed it up, and I pay tribute to him for that. So as I've already said, and full enough, Mr McCabe, it's disappointing that there's no Tory backbenchers here to back up this policy. Maybe that says how bad this policy is, or maybe they're just choosing to back the corrupt Prime Minister in another place. But the point is, only agreeing to provide welfare support for two children is a horrible policy. And it's a horrible policy backed up by dog whistle politics. Now, the concept clearly was that people should be able to afford children, just like those who rely solely on work for their income and therefore don't need additional welfare support. That is language designed to infer that end-to-end benefits is a scrounger, that people have children just to screw the welfare system. It's truly awful, and actually it's putting a price on children. But the thing is, as we've heard, for affected families, who suffer the most? It's the children. Hungry kids cannot learn at school. Hungry kids will be disadvantaged and less likely to have a positive outcome. So whatever circle the Tories think they're breaking, they actually might be condemning more people to underachieve, more people to have a higher chance of unemployment, to be less likely to participate in higher and further education, and more likely to end up in lower paid semi-skilled work. And as the Honourable Member for Strangford said, if some children suffer, others do. It's not just the ones directly affected. Now, the worst of all this is that the entire concept is based in politics, in prejudice, and not evidence. What we now do have clear as day is evidence of how this policy is working and those that are affected by the two-child policy. Now, the House of Commons Library briefing confirms that of 317,500 families who were affected in April 2021, 56% of these families had somebody in the household working. A majority, also 56%, were in dual-parent households. So the majority of families affected are dual-parent households with some employment. Proof, then, that policy is based on falsehoods, and proof the actual bigger issue, Mr McCabe, is that too many people are actually in low-paid, unsecure jobs and that's the issue that should be tackled. And then we have to consider, what about these people who have lost jobs or face reduced income due to COVID? They now find that the so-called safety net of the welfare state is a lot smaller than they would have anticipated. The Tory Brexit has also impacted jobs too. Now, Tories deny this, but I've got a meeting tomorrow with somebody that runs a haulage company, and he's close to going under, which will take other jobs with him because of the ludicrous cabotage rules that the Tory government signed up to. And also COVID, unfortunately, gave us fire and rehire, another policy that the Tories have done nothing to eliminate, but it's a policy that is vastly reducing incomes of thousands of workers or seeing them sacked. Workers that the Tories might otherwise have seen as model families who were able to afford their children without welfare support, but now actually they need that support and it might not be there for them. Families and people have lost jobs and are now having to readjust their outgoings accordingly, but yet they're now find they're being categorised as scroungers by the Tory government. Now, another key issue of the two-child clause is that, as others have said, it disproportionately affects Orthodox, Jewish and Muslim families who may have religious or ethical views in family size. And again, I agree with the intervention from the member for Strangford that this religious aspect in terms of discrimination has got possible human rights implications as well. Now, we've heard about how some women need to consider or have considered abortion because they're worried about the effects of not being able to afford their child. And there are debates about how many women have actually undertook abortion because of this. But the reality is women are having to face that choice, and they shouldn't have to face that choice. And again, it's something the Minister needs to look at and review.
Would you give way on that?
Yeah,
Of course, there are debates on it, but the statistics are very clear, and the National Audit Office numbers show that since 2016, since this policy came into being, there has been a 24% increase in the number of abortions taking place in England and Wales.
Okay, I think that, and I'm not going to disagree, and the honourable member for Strangford also referred to the evidential work done by LSE as well. And again, this is evidence that government should be looking at. If we're talking about a government that talks about family values, how can you talk about family values when you're forcing women to consider abortion? And Mr McCabe, this also takes us to other evidence in terms of the impact of this. So, since 2013-14, child poverty amongst larger families has risen dramatically. Almost half of all children living in families that have more than 2 children live in poverty. And recent research by the Benefits Changes in Larger Family Studies shows that most of the recent rise in child poverty overall has been driven by rising poverty amongst those larger families. Sarah Ogilvie of the Child Poverty Action Group has said the 2-child limit is a brutal policy that punishes children simply for having brothers and sisters. It forces families to survive in less than need, and with soaring living costs, the hardship and hunger these families face will only intensify. And also, according to CPAG, removing the policy would actually immediately lift 250,000 children out of poverty. So surely the Minister has got to review the evidence and act accordingly and try and do that action to lift children out of poverty. And then if we look at the rape exemption clause, it was apparent that that was thought up in the hoof at the time. Probably some loose nod to thinking that they were adding a moral and noble exemption to support children born after the traumatic outcome of their mother having been raped. But no wonder ministers at the time couldn't even explain how the policy would be implemented, because it was so absurd. No thought of the traumatic psychological effects of the woman having to relive the experience and being asked to fill in forms to justify financial support for her child. And the bizarre logic is only for subsequent children beyond the 2-children limit born of rape. So if the clause in itself isn't abhorrent enough, it's somehow seen as morally okay to decide which child born from rape is worthy of support. It is truly disgusting. And Mr McCabe, the other big aspect aligned with this and other policies at the time was the whole balance in the books mantra. Now, today's debate actually made me revisit the 2015 Summer Budget Red Book. When I look back at that, honestly, it's truly horrifying to see how evil that budget was. The 2-child clause estimated to save £3.4 billion by 2021. Freezing the benefits, £11.3 billion. Benefit cap reduction, £1.7 billion clawed back from the poor. Increasing tax credits taper to 48%, while reducing income thresholds and tax credits and work allowance was estimated to save an astonishing nearly £20 billion by 2021. So a complete and utter hatchet job in the welfare state, and incoherent policies actually given the attack on some of the job-related welfare support. So much for making work pay. An awful budget, and I do have to point out it was shameful Labour abstained on that. But what about this balancing the books mantra? Well, clearly, as I've just illustrated, it's balancing the books in the poorest, the most infirm and the lowest paid in society. But what it did actually also allow was in subsequent budgets was tax giveaways to those that the Tories were deemed worthy of benefiting from these giveaways. Previously, I had the House of Commons Library do analysis on some of the key budget decisions that were implemented from 2016 to 2018. Now, they did extrapolation of these figures based on figures that were presented in the budget books up to the year 2025. And to the year 2025, it was estimated the Treasury was giving away £80 billion. Increasing the higher rate threshold, £5 billion. ISA changes, £7 billion. Inheritance tax changes, £6 billion giveaway. Personal allowance increase and further raising the higher threshold to £50,000 of income. That was a £11 giveaway by the Tories, and it was a £50 billion giveaway in corporation tax, although at least they've realised the error of their ways in that one. But it shows plenty of money was found for giveaways rather than to actually continue to properly balance the books. And these figures show that they could easily afford to reverse this two-child policy if the political will was there. And then, Mr McCabe, if we return to the here and now, another issue of universal tax overall is, of course, the removal of the uplift, or more appropriately, a cut of £1,040 a year. As Honourable Member for Cannon Valley said, if the pandemic merited an uplift to allow people a more dignified living, then surely with inflation running at 78%, the energy cap up 75% compared to April 2021, and petrol at record prices, surely there's a clear need for a permanent increase in universal credit. And I too, as the Honourable Member for Glasgow Central said, I too cannot finish without comparing what's happening in Scotland with the Scottish Government. They introduced the game-changing child payment, doubling it to £20 a week, and it's actually going to increase to £25 a week when the benefit's extended to under 2016s by the end of this year. But of course, it's been done in a fixed budget in the Scottish Parliament, and it therefore also cannot have the same positive impact otherwise would have, because of course we're still living with the impact of Tory austerity. It's proof that whatever the Scottish Government does is undertaken with one hand behind their back. It was also interesting, there was a strong theme earlier on there at the fact that the Welsh Government needs more powers too. So it's quite clearly the Tory policies is having an impact in the Union, and perhaps that should also make the Minister take note. But will the Minister pledge to review the effects of the impact of the Scottish Government child payment policy and the support it's actually received from charitable organisations? The bottom line is, at a stroke, the Scottish Government has shown that we are treating all children equally, and that surely should not be too much to ask of any government, to treat all children equally, and surely it's time for the government to think again.
Yeah.